I'm Yang here with another half an hour of dialogue live from Beijing. The DPRK says it successfully carried out a nuclear detonation on Tuesday, despite almost unanimous international condemnation. The nuclear blast signals a major step towards mounting a small nuclear warhead on long-range missiles that could target nations such as the United States. China and the U.S. have both protested against this latest test, the third nuclear test of its kind carried out by the DPRK. Beijing is calling for calm from all parties and for a return to six-party nuclear disarmament talks.
What will Pyongyang gain or lose in carrying out its third nuclear test despite international warnings? How will its neighbors in Northeast Asia face the reality of the DPRK being a de facto nuclear power? Despite China's growing unhappiness over the DPRK's nuclear program, China insists that regional stability be maintained.
我们希望有关各方不要采取使半岛局势进一步紧张升级的行动。
Does it mean China would block any UN sanctions? And will the permanent members of the UN Security Council reach consensus over how to punish the DPRK?
Welcome back. We are joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Tao Wenzhao, Senior Research Fellow with the CAS, and Mr. Anna Tangen, our American current affairs commentator. And later on, we shall be talking to our correspondent in South Korea, Ms. Eugene, on telephone. Welcome to our dialogue here. I'm sorry that the quietness of the Spring Festival has been seriously disturbed because of the nuclear test. What do you think of, say, the official statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry? Because all Chinese media have been running commentaries. They are not very happy about the detonation, I'm afraid.
Of course, we're not happy with the new nuclear test, and actually the third nuclear test by DPRK. Well, I think the spokesman of Foreign Ministry has elaborated official Chinese policy towards the issue. And according to some foreign media, before that, China made tremendous efforts to persuade the DPRK not to have a nuclear test. But DPRK did not listen to China. So we are not happy with that. But of course, China has been made great efforts in the past few years to stabilize the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And actually, for some certain time, we reached some kind of a result, like a common declaration of September 19th in 2005. And in certain period, we did reach a kind of a denuclearization process in the DPRK.
And I'm afraid we see more of the censure and dissatisfaction from embattled Chinese media about the nuclear tests. What do you think of the possibility that our limited influence has further been marginalized because of, first of all, our support of the UN sanctions against the nuclearization in the Korean Peninsula?
I think all eyes in the world are now looking at China and what the situation is, as you supply most of their fuel. A lot of the goods coming in, $2 billion annually in trade. With those kind of statistics, people are going to be looking at China and seeing what it does. This idea that they are turning a deaf ear to the only group that has really been supporting them is going to be troubling across the world.
Well, Mr. Tao Wenzhao, do you think the detonation is more of a legitimate defense about the core national interests of the DPRK, which is viewed as the closest ally of the PRC, or this is none other than a provocation, which has violated our national interest?
Well, I think we should make careful distinguishing the situation during the Cold War and the situation today. DPRK is not our ally. No, China's policy is non-alignment. And of course, China has profound national interests in preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. China is a member of NPT, Non-Proliferation Act. China has a solemn obligation and before the world. So that's why we support. We have been supportive of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1718, 1875, and 2000. 87, just a few months ago.
President Obama delivered a written protest against the latest nuclear test by the DPRK, and he calls for swift and legitimate and convincing measures to be taken against the defiance of the DPRK. At the same time, Professor Tao Wendao says we are not an ally of the DPRK. Do you buy this idea?
It's not a question of whether I buy it. It's a question of whether it's going to work and how China reacts to it. The issue is that if you look at 2087, they said there are 4 officials could not travel outside of North Korea, and 6 companies, and we're not even certain that those companies had assets overseas, that if they had assets overseas, they could be frozen. I think the time where there can be meaningful sanctions is drawn to an end. I think 2087 demonstrated that very, very clearly. The question is, what is the next step? The danger here, and the elephant in the corner, is if they were to do something unthinkable, which is launch a long-range rocket directly at the U.S., and what the consequences would be.
Do you think the nuclear device is allegedly miniaturized, small enough to be mounted on long-range missiles targeting the U.S.?
Not at present. It takes a few years, probably, as U.S. scientist Hacker said, at least it takes 5 years to miniaturize the nuclear facility, which is able to be placed on the long-range missile, intercontinental missile, to threaten the United States if it wants. Yeah, so at present, certainly it's not. DPRK does not have such advanced technology.
I know, but the issue of whether they have the technology or not, it's just unthinkable. Even if they fired all of their missiles at the U.S. and they hit some cities or whatever, the aftermath, the second strike by the U.S. would be devastating. They would take out population centers and they would retaliate. And this could lead to a really big problem internationally.
Thank you very much. We now cross over to Ms. Yu Jin, our correspondent in Seoul, ROK. Hello.
Hi, Yang Rui.
As usual, Yu Jin, what can you tell us about the latest response from the local media towards the test?
Well, it's been a very busy day in South Korea today, thanks to the DPRK's nuclear test. President Lee summoned an emergency meeting on national security, and the local media have been reporting on that. Their team at the presidential office said this nuclear test is a clear violation of the UN Security Council's resolution, and South Korea requested the UN Security Council to hold an emergency meeting first thing in the morning in New York. South Korea will actually be chairing this meeting on Tuesday. We first learned about the nuclear test through the Defense Ministry, where they announced that they had detected a man-made earthquake of a magnitude of about 4.9 coming from the test site in Punggye-ri, in the northeastern tip of the Korean Peninsula. And soon after that, we confirmed from the weather agency that there have been air sound waves coming from that area, confirming that it is indeed a man-made nuclear test. And we've seen a lot of efforts by the Foreign Ministry as well as other teams in the government trying to get the diplomatic efforts and military efforts in place to protect the Korean Peninsula. Yang Rui?
We, at the same time, saw joint bipartisan condemnation against the DPRK nuclear testing. But does it mean that the newly elected President Pyo Jin-hui will have to reconsider her initial idea of reconciling with the DPRK, because he promised on the campaign to have greater engagement with the northern brothers and sisters? What do you think of this idea, the prospects of getting tough?
Right, she's in a very difficult position because she hasn't even started her term as president. She's still the president-elect, and the situation on the Korean Peninsula has just gotten extremely worse as of this afternoon. The incumbent president, Lee Myung-bak, actually invited President-elect Park Geun-hye to the Blue House this afternoon. They had a closed meeting for about 20 to 30 minutes. They agreed there that they will maintain a consistent policy towards the DPRK during this transition period. They also said the DPRK's nuclear test will only further isolate the DPRK from the rest of the world. So Park Geun-hye said also through her transition team spokesperson that she strongly denounces the DPRK's nuclear test. Now, as you mentioned, Park has consistently said she's going to seek to build trust with the DPRK. But back then, she also had stated that Pyongyang needs to show sincere efforts first by following through with denuclearization. Now that that condition hasn't been met, Park Geun-hye will have no choice but to stick to a more stern policy towards the DPRK when she does get inaugurated on the 25th of February.
What do you think will happen to the joint economic zone between the two Koreas as a result of the latest tensions escalating between the two sides?
Well, so far the Unification Ministry stands on, you're referring to the Kaesong Industrial Complex there. So far the Unification Ministry's stance has been that they're not going to use that particular area as a measure against the DPRK in any way. What they did do today was they confirmed that the 600 or so South Korean nationals who were there in that Kaesong Industrial Complex were safe, and their safety, and they confirmed that they're safe, and they said there haven't been any unusual movements detected in that area today. So, I mean, we may not know in the days to come what may happen to that Kaesong Industrial Complex, but for now, that area is more or less seen as a safe zone that should not be impacted by these diplomatic activities taking place around the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you very much for being with us. That's Ms. Yu Jin, our CCTV correspondent in Seoul. ROK, welcome back. What do you think of the timing of nuclear detonation just hours before the delivery of the State of the Union speech by President Obama to the joint session of the U.S. Congress?
Timing can always be a question, but I think it is not important here, timing.
I would disagree. I would disagree. I think he wanted to really put a message across. Remember, just on February 5th, he sent that bizarre video showing America under attack and, laughing about it.
Yeah.
But is that an online game instead of being an official statement?
This is not
attacking the U.S. city.
Because the DPRK has been making preparation for new nuclear tests for a long time. And last December, it launched successfully the rockets or satellites according to DPRK, and then United Nations passed a new resolution 2087, and then DPRK said, we will have a retaliation, very serious retaliation. So the retaliation
aims at humiliating the U.S. at a critical moment when the newly elected president wanted to deliver the State of the Union speech.
Well, and also South Korean, I think more importantly, probably...
Yeah. Before inauguration of the South Korean president-elect.
Yeah. So I think if they carefully calculate the timing, then I think it's very stupid.
Yeah, but what do you think is the end game here? I'm trying to figure this out. He is going after China. He's invoking uniform condemnation from the world community. How is this going to help? Where is this going?
Yeah,
what do you mean by end game?
Well, there doesn't seem to be an end game. I mean, over a period of time, he has just gone out and provoked everybody, including his closest, we won't say ally, but the closest country to him. To one that gives him $2 billion in trade a year, 10% of their GDP.
I think the end game is to be a nuclear power.
But
and
they can't...
it is written into the constitution of the PRK.
Well, here is one counter-argument. Yeah. So long as the U.S., along with other allies of Washington, allow the DPRK to be integrated into the rest of the world, then that amounts to security assurance. And that means the DPRK is likely to abandon its nuclear ambition. What do you think of this legitimate argument?
There are
but Washington refuses to do that.
There are arguments in that way, but the behavior of this particular government, even towards its closest allies, would say that they're not acting in a rational manner. I don't think China or anybody else in this area wants to see a nuclear proliferation game going on. And the fact that you have 7 missiles that can strike 3/4 of the world does not make you a nuclear power. It means you have nuclear missiles. But before that day comes, I think other groups will step in. They're not interested in having a group that is this unstable trying to push its way onto the international nuclear power base.
Well, the rest of the world prefers to see China as an ally, if not the closest ally, the only ally of the DPRK, in that we want to use the DPRK as a buffer zone against the U.S. military presence, which is composed of, say, 28,000 troops, other than 38 or 37,000 American troops in Okinawa, Japan.
50,000 Okinawa.
50,000.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's a lot. That's a lot. What do you think of this argument?
First of all, as I just mentioned, the situation during the Cold War was different from the situation today. And I personally
this year would witness the 50th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, with the signing of the armistice instead of a peace treaty.
Yeah, and I personally do not use the buffer zone anymore. Yeah, and today's war or today's battle is quite different from the past. And I personally even think that after the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, probably U.S. will not again to launch such a grand war against any country.
Thank you very much. We have to leave you there at this moment. Up next, we'll take a quick look at the highlights of the previous two nuclear tests that took place separately in 2006 and 2009. Stay with us.
On October the 9th, 2006, the DPRK defied international warnings and carried out its first ever nuclear test. The DPRK's state news agency hailed it a success, claiming the test had been conducted with 100% indigenous wisdom and technology. The UN Security Council responded quickly. It unanimously agreed sanctions against the DPRK and urged the country to cease nuclear testing and halt its missile program. Despite a push for a diplomatic breakthrough in 2007 and 2008, efforts to deter the DPRK's nuclear ambitions were unsuccessful. On May 25, 2009, 3 years after the first test, the DPRK conducted a second nuclear test. The US Geological Survey confirmed a seismic disturbance at the time in the country's northeast. The UN reacted once again. Voicing its strong opposition and condemnation of the test, the Security Council issued a fresh resolution in June 2009, expanding its arms embargo.
What will Pyongyang gain or lose in carrying out its third nuclear test despite international warnings? How will its neighbors in Northeast Asia face the reality of the DPRK being a de facto nuclear power? Despite China's growing unhappiness over the DPRK's nuclear program, China insists that regional stability be maintained.
我们希望有关各方不要采取使半岛局势进一步紧张升级的行动。
Doesn't mean China would block any UN sanctions. And will the permanent members of the UN Security Council reach consensus over how to punish the DPRK?
Welcome back. I see differences between the American position and the Chinese one on the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula. The Chinese would always insist that the stability be prioritized instead of the smart talk of having nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. The U.S. says no. Whatever the cost, we got to get rid of nuclear weapons or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. What do you think of the differences here?
Well, I think stability, of course, is our purpose. To keep stability at home, to keep stability in our surrounding countries, and also in Northeast Asia. But to keep stability, we need two processes. One process to deal with nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. The other process to try integrate DPRK into the regional community. And today's nuclear issue is a result of 60 years of a hostile relationship between the United States and DPRK. So it's very complicated. Yeah. Well, China maintains economic and trade relations with DPRK, and for that, China has been accusing a lot in the world.
We came under fire from the international society for providing economic investment and humanitarian assistance.
If you further box it up, it may become desperate.
What do you think?
I think that's it.
Look,
Look,
what do you
we
think
got
of
over
this?
things with Vietnam. I mean, we lost soldiers and things like that. It's still run by the same government.
South
that
Koreans,
defeated us.
ironically, have been calling for suspending our economic assistance to the DPRK. But and then the Chinese argued, hey, what do you mean by that? Because if we suspended our economic investment, hundreds of thousands of your North Korean brothers and sisters would starve to death. They would be killed by starvation. What would be their national feeling?
They could also starve as well because the government decides to divert
Army first
resources,
principle.
not just the Army first, but to programs which are very expensive, like this nuclear program. When you're putting resources into something like this, you are in fact eating up the available resources that your people can use. I mean, right now, China, in good faith, a year ago, started a second economic zone on the Yalu River. Those two islands are sitting behind fences. There's no activity. This is a direct slap in the face. I mean, you're trying to push the economic card. You're trying to bring them in, but they don't seem to be listening. At what time does your patience fray?
But I'm afraid those Chinese who did make investment in North Korea complain a lack of respect in contract and corruption, which is rampant there. But what do you make of the charisma of the young Kim, latest leader of the family control in the DPRK regime? Now, he grew up on Google, unlike his father, who grew up on letters and stamps. So, in a way, the young Kim should be more liberal. And has a vision, about what the international society is like.
Well, I think we see different signs of the young Kim. Actually, on the one hand, some people noticed that he emphasized about economic development, about people's living standard, about using technology and technique, science to develop economy. In his New Year's speech. But on the other hand, he has not changed the military first policy. And as I mentioned, DPRK will become a nuclear power. It is written into the constitution.
Seeing is believing,
signs.
Anna. Seeing is believing. Have you ever been to the DPRK? No. Well, you may have been taken hostage if you didn't go there.
Well, it wasn't that.
On
so
charges of
concern.
spying,
No.
perhaps.
It's just I can't get a visa to go in. So.
But the quiet changes are said to have been taking place and are said to be taking shape in the private market there. So, what do you think of the positive changes in our neighboring country, the DPRK?
That's what we want. Yeah, we want DPRK to put the emphasis to focus on the economic development, and we want DPRK to make a gradual reform to develop.
But what do you think of the strong mixed feelings of Pyongyang towards the required changes, I mean economic ones in this regime, because that will lead to the end of the family control, I'm afraid. For example, previously, people there were not allowed to use the short waves of a transistor radio for fear of getting connected with the rest of the world, for fear of getting enlightened. I mean, that's,
well, of course,
dictatorship, right?
No, of course, Yang Kim would consolidate his power basis, or preserve the family rule, etc. But on the other hand, he sees. He knows outside the world, and his father, even his father, knows the outside well.
Because they are both fans of 007, James Bond, and the French wine.
For all their knowledge, it does not seem to be changing their actions. As you said, it's actions above words. At this point, we have some very, very serious behavior that is in contravention to everything that you have just been saying that China has been pushing. This is a very, very difficult. I'm sure at the highest levels there must be some anger at this kind of...
one of the major points in the official statement of the Chinese ministry in their response to the latest nuclear testing is a hopeful return to the six-party denuclearization talks. But this is actually fantasy, I'm afraid. The DPRK has declared, they will not resume the talks because they refuse to be used by China, allegedly, as a bargaining chip in enhancing our regional influence.
It happened before. DPRK, first of all, announced that six-party talks was dead, and then they returned back to six-party talks. That happened before. Yeah, I think
But that was a delaying
yeah.
tactic
Yeah.
at the point. It was quite clear they were always asking for something. They'd say, buy us off, and then they would violate the terms of it.
And we were accused of buying time for the DPRK by the Americans.
Well, we bought time in the Middle
Instead
East.
of calling China a broker of the six-party talks, they start to label China as a troublemaker, sort of.
Well, I don't know. The issue is the amount of economic aid that comes in, and China is going to have a very difficult position in the ongoing things because the amount of condemnation that's gone through here, and China's previous signal that they were joining in on some sanctions has made Pyongyang angry. And the question is, will China go ahead with it? If China does get involved, $2 billion worth of trade ends, 500,000 tons of fuel ends. I mean, this could be devastating to the economy. Is that a good thing? I mean, the Arab Spring.
Controversially, the image of China remains pretty bad since 2 years ago, and a lot in the international society say that China is increasingly isolated because of assertiveness in the foreign policy. Now, do you think China is likely to use this crisis in the Korean Peninsula as an opportunity to improve ties with, for example, Washington, in the hope of, reducing their hostile attitude towards China in the South China Sea and over Diaoyu Islands?
I don't think so. Actually, I see those issues separate. You know, the
different issues.
nuclear issue has nothing to do with the South China Sea issue and with the Diaoyu Islands issue. They're different. So we have to deal with those issues differently.
Okay, no, but if China steps up and takes this idea of the G2, that we will take care of things in our backyard and that we will lead to overall global stability by preventing things like this, I think it would be a very, very well accepted sign in Washington. What they do with it, I don't know.
We are both stakeholders, aren't we, in the same boat?
One thing is important.
We need economic prosperity.
China and the United States should have more consultation on those issues. And actually, Glenn Davis just visited China, South Korea, and Japan a few weeks ago. And
who is this guy?
Glenn Davis is U.S. representative to six-party talks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think China and the United States should take this opportunity to have more consultations on the security issue of the Northeast Asia. This is important.
But this is a very big departure from the six-party talks. If the U.S. and China sit together on this and start having consultations, there's going to be repercussions. I think an issue about the G2 pushing itself onto the stage, that there'll be no room for other people. So it's a yin and yang thing. It's every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Thank you very much. The Pacific Ocean is indeed big enough to contain or to accommodate the needs of the two major powers, the U.S. and China. And one of the testing scores, I'm afraid, is the latest situation in the Korean Peninsula. I'm Yang Rui. See you next time for the Happy Chinese Lunar New Year. The official statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, because all Chinese media have been running commentaries, they are not very happy about the detonation, I'm afraid.
Of course, we're not happy with the new nuclear test, and actually the third nuclear test by DPRK. Well, I think the spokesman of Foreign Ministry has elaborated official Chinese policy towards the issue. And according to some foreign media, before that, China made tremendous efforts to persuade the DPRK not to have a nuclear test, but DPRK did not listen to China. So we are not happy with that. But of course, China has been made great efforts in the past few years to stabilize the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And actually, for some certain time, we reached some kind of a result, like a common declaration of September 19th in 2005. And in certain period, we did reach a kind of a denuclearization process in the DPRK.
And I'm afraid we see more of the censure and dissatisfaction from embattled Chinese media about the nuclear tests. What do you think of the possibility that our limited influence has further been marginalized because of, first of all, our support of the UN sanctions against the nuclearization in the Korean Peninsula?
I think all eyes in the world are now looking at China and what the situation is, as you supply most of their fuel. A lot of the goods coming in, $2 billion annually in trade. With those kind of statistics, people are going to be looking at China and seeing what it does. This idea that they are turning a deaf ear to the only group that has really been supporting them is going to be troubling across the world.
Well, Mr. Tawin, do you think the detonation is more of a legitimate defense about the core national interests of the DPRK, which is viewed as the closest ally of the PRC, or this is none other than a provocation, which has
All its neighbors in Northeast Asia face the reality of the DPRK being a de facto nuclear power. Despite China's growing unhappiness over the DPRK's nuclear program, China insists that regional stability be maintained.
我们希望有关各方不要采取使半岛局势进一步紧张升级的行动。
Does it mean China would block any UN sanctions? And will the permanent members of the UN Security Council reach consensus over how to punish the DPRK?
Welcome back. We are joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Tao Wen-zhao, Senior Research Fellow with the CAS, and Mr. Anna Tangen, our American current affairs commentator. And later on, we shall be talking to our correspondent in South Korea, Ms. Yu Jin, on telephone. Welcome to our dialogue here. I'm sorry that the quietness of the Spring Festival has been seriously disturbed because of the nuclear test. What do you think of, say, violated our national interest?
Well, I think we should make careful distinguishing the situation during the Cold War and the situation today. DPRK is not our ally. No, China's policy is non-alignment. Yeah, and of course, China has profound national interests in preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. China is a member of NPT, Non-Proliferation Act. China has a solemn obligation and before the world. Yeah. So that's why we support. We have been supportive of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1718, 1875, and 2087, just a few months ago.
President Obama delivered a written protest against the latest nuclear test. I'm Yang Rui here with another half an hour of dialogue live from Beijing. The DPRK says it successfully carried out a nuclear detonation on Tuesday, despite almost unanimous international condemnation. The nuclear blast signals a major step towards mounting a small nuclear warhead on long-range missiles that could target nations such as the United States. China and the US have both protested against this latest test, the third nuclear test of its kind carried out by the DPRK. Beijing is calling for calm from all parties and for a return to six-party nuclear disarmament talks.
What will Pyongyang gain or lose in carrying out its third nuclear test despite international warnings?